They parked the old Buick at the end of a rutted logging road and climbed the final slope on hands and knees, because Pride and Annie couldn't manage stairs like they used to. The mountain air smelled like cedar and rain, and the cabin sat crooked on its foundation. The roof sagged, the porch railing had given up, and the windows were clouded with neglect. Their children had made a decision. "We can't take you in," they'd said, delivering words that felt like a verdict. Reasons, space, work, timing, sounded like polite excuses. Pride had been proud of the family he built. Now that pride felt thin. Annie held his arm and breathed the clean air. For a moment the hurt didn't exist. The mountain didn't care about family arguments. Here the wind argued with the pines and refused to take sides. The first nights were cold. The wood stove had to be coaxed into life, and the mattress carried the ghost of someone else's dreams. They slept under quilts Annie had packed, woke to sunlight slipping through holes in the roof, and found that the mountain offered a kind of honesty they never expected. No calls came to remind them of obligations. They learned to be present to their own small needs. Rebuilding began with small rebellions. Pride swept decades of dust into neat piles, found a hatchet in the shed, and felt a thrill part child, part craftsman. Annie mended the porch railing and planted hop vines along the fence. They learned the mountain's rhythm, where the spring gave clear water, which ridge warmed early, where the deer walked. People began to notice. Neighbors offered quiet help, firewood stacked at dawn, a bag of potatoes left by a truck window. Pride and Annie accepted with awkward gratitude, learning how to say thank you without apology. Pride fashioned a bench from reclaimed oak. Annie turned her kitchen into a workshop, stitching pillows from old shirts. They planted a garden in a sun patch the deer couldn't reach. What started as survival became making. The first winter tested them. Snow cut the road in places. The wood's silence made their bones ache. Annie's cough, which she had hidden from their children, worsened and made trips to town urgent. They made a promise one frosty morning. "We'll make it beautiful," Annie said. Pride nodded. They set to work on their paradise with stubborn joy. Neighbors taught them tricks. Eli wired a rain barrel. Ramon taught them to read the bees. A traveling painter painted a bluebird on the cabin's back wall. Small stones formed a path to a viewpoint where the valley fell away. As the garden grew, people came. Children curious for tomatoes, teenagers wanting a quiet place, a single father wanting to teach his son to hammer. The cabin became a hub. They offered shelter to those who needed it and asked nothing in return. The villagers learned this was a sanctuary. A little sign appeared by the path. "Take what you need, leave what you can." Jars of preserves appeared on the windowsill with masking tape notes. The economy of the place became one of giving that replenished itself. They had not always been strangers to luck. Pride had worked years at a factory, coming home with oil under his nails, and Annie kept rhythms, starched the sheets on Thursdays, can peaches in late summer. They had adopted 2 teenagers once, children that had been in need, and raised them with the same blunt, steady love they used for everything, patience and stubbornness. So the abandonment felt like a misfired promise. It hurt in ways polite excuses could not name. The years before the mountain had patterns of small betrayals. Invitations stopped arriving, holiday calls dulled, and excuses tightened like a noose until the final message came. They couldn't keep them. The night they left the city, Pride realized grief could be precise. It fit into boxes, fit under blankets, fit into the back seat beside a suitcase. On the mountain the scale changed. Tasks replaced worry. Fix the stove. Mend the fence. Plant the beans. They rescued a dog Mariah named Patch, a ragged creature who became a small thunder of joy at the edge of the bench. Patch woke Pride on cold nights and made him walk the moonlit path. He chased a fox once and brought back a glove like an offering. The dog was a living answer to the question, who will come with us when most others leave? Annie found an old skill inside her, grafting. She learned to splice a scion with the care of a surgeon and the hope of a poet. The first graft died. The second lived. The third bore fruit that tasted like mornings. Word of the pears travelled by mouth. Someone came to ask for a cutting, and another walked away with a jar of preserves. The cabin began to trade in abundance rather than scarcity. Pride's bench became a place where people told their small absolutions. Men brought worries they couldn't tell their fathers. Teenagers came to learn to tie knots and leave with a sandwich. Pride listened the way someone listens who knows storms come and go. Sometimes he gave advice. Sometimes he simply sat beside them until the silence changed and things felt smaller. They started a weekly potluck. No judging allowed. The table filled with dishes that had names and histories. A woman named June brought macaroni she said her mother had learned during rationing. A young man who had run from trouble left an old radio and a bag of potatoes. The gatherings were messy and imperfect, exactly like the lives they came from. The rule held: everyone could take, everyone could give. That reciprocity knit the cabin into the community. There were conflicts, too. A dispute over a property line once flared, and a man shouted by a pickup. Pride walked down with a lantern and a voice that didn't try to shame but to remember a neighbor's name. He negotiated a solution, and the man who had yelled ended up bringing a wheelbarrow of mulch the next week. Small defeats and small reconciliations became more common than the dramatic ruptures of the past. News came in a trickle. A college student wrote an essay. A regional paper published a photo of a bowl of peaches. Some offers of help were transactional and odd. Others were tender and steady. Strangers sent letters of thanks. The couple kept the publicity small. They preferred real visits and hands that left fingerprints on their jars. Their son returned slowly. After an awkward first visit, he began to call, then came up with his children to plant beans. Apologies were small and practical. He stood in the yard on the anniversary and thanked them for teaching him things that mattered: how to fix a wheel, how to be patient with a stubborn seed. Forgiveness didn't arrive with trumpets. It arrived in the planting of a row of beans and in visits that became habits. Years passed. The roof was replaced, the garden expanded, fruit trees bowed with abundance. Young couples planted saplings as gifts. A small woodworking cooperative formed from old barn beams. Strangers sent letters and readers offered small kindnesses. The couple kept their life measured by the chicken's cluck, the stove's steady burn, and the way light moved over the bench at dawn. There were winters that humbled them. Once a spring storm gouged the access road, and they spent 3 days cut off while snow drifted above the tires of the Buick. They rationed what they had: soup, crackers, a slab of cheddar, and traded stories by the stove. The bellies of the children who came during summer kept the memory of that hunger at bay when times were easier. A neighbor with a snowplow cleared the road and left a pot of chili that smelled like rescue. Small hands left marks on the bench. Children carved initials beneath the seat, a secret registry that made Pride smile when he sat down. Teenagers learned to split wood properly, and an old neighbor taught a boy how to sharpen an axe. Those lessons made the mountain feel continuous, like threads linking generation to generation. Patch grew old too, and when he finally died the town held a small funeral. People came with flowers and dug a grave near the apple trees. They kept letters from strangers, notes saying simply, "Thank you." The couple read them on damp afternoons and felt the truth of being seen. The mountain was not a cure. It was a place to practice being human. They practiced kindness, repairs, patience, and acceptance. The paradise they'd made was not that pain was gone, but that there was room to move through it. When their bodies finally asked for help, the community provided. Eli and others built a ramp so Pride could slide would easier. Mariah took horticulture classes and led pruning workshops. Volunteers carried meals on bad weather days. The reciprocity was the proof that the life they had made was not spare. It was full in a different way. On their 50th wedding anniversary, neighbors came with pies and songs. Their son stood and spoke in a voice that shook. He thanked them and admitted he had been wrong in ways that had nothing to do with excuses. Tears braided with laughter. Pride and Annie danced slow steps on the yard's worn grass. What made the cabin a paradise was practice. It was the choice to rebuild dignity, to accept help, and to give back. They learned that communities can repair what families sometimes break. Eli and others built a small shed with a ramp when Pride grew too tired to chop wood. A child named Mariah learned to braid Annie's hair. They took care of one another because shared survival tasted better than solitary endurance. They never stopped being surprised that joy could grow out of ruin. Grandchildren made forts in apple trees. The bluebird mural faded but remained a guardian. The for sale sign was gone, replaced by a small wooden board in a child's handwriting. This is our home. There were hard nights when the children were a shadow at the foot of the bed, a question of why and how to stay angry without turning brittle. Pride would wake early and stand at the window, hands on the sill, and watch the light find the tops of pine trees. It was in those hours that he learned forgiveness not as a grand moral act, but as a practical one. Forgive to make room for waking, for moving, for planting seeds rather than souring like forgotten fruit. In the end, the paradise was a slow accumulation of choices. It was a decision made on cold mornings and hot afternoons, in the quiet hours after a child's shout echoed through the yard. It was a bench made by hand, a patched quilt, a bowl of peaches given freely. It was a community that learned to keep one another. It was a couple who steered into abandonment and found a way to make a life beautiful again. When the last harvest came, and pears hung heavy and sweet, Pride took Annie's hand and said, "We did all right." She squeezed his hand and looked at the valley and the bench where names had been carved by people who'd once been strangers. The mountain listened back.